They say the lantern guides the lost, but here...
The first one I recognized was my neighbor's kid, 11 years old, still wearing the travel soccer jersey his mother had ironed the creases out of 2 days before. And he was pulling a woman's arm out of its socket on the median strip of Route 9 while the traffic light above him cycled green, yellow, red, like the intersection still had opinions about a right-of-way. I was parked at the Citgo across the street. I had just paid for gas with my debit card and bought a coffee I hadn't opened yet. The coffee was in the cup holder. The receipt was in my hand. And through the windshield, I watched Caleb Turner, who I'd watched score a hat trick at the Northfield rec fields 2 Saturdays ago while his dad screamed from a folding chair. I watched him do something to that woman that I am not going to describe, because the description isn't what matters. What matters is that I sat in my truck and did nothing. What matters is that the receipt was still in my hand when he finished. If you want to know why I didn't move that day, consider subscribing. And tell me in the comments where you're listening from tonight. My name is Ward Ellison. I'm 41. I was a firefighter for the town of Northfield for 16 years. And before that, I was a candidate at the academy in Montpelier. And before that, I was a kid who set a brush fire behind his grandmother's house and watched the trucks come screaming up the access road and decided that was the only job worth doing. I had been off the department for 14 months when the world changed. Not retired, removed. There's a difference, and I'll get to it because the getting to it is why I ended up where I ended up, and why the building I turned into something unrecognizable used to be the place where I thought I was worth something. I drove north on Route 9 instead of south. South was home. A rental duplex in Brattleboro with a landlord who texted me monthly about the recycling bins. North was Northfield. North was Station 2. Where Engine 4 and Ladder 1 lived in a red brick building from 1931 with an apparatus bay wide enough for 3 rigs and a second floor that the department had converted into a bunk room in the 80s and then half converted into storage when the overnight shifts got cut in 2019. I knew that building the way you know a body you've lived inside. I knew which bay doors stuck on its track. I knew that the kitchen exhaust fan vented to the east wall and in summer pulled the smell of the lilac hedge through the entire second floor. I knew the roof access ladder on the north side had a rung that flexed at the 7th step. I had no plan. I had instinct and 14 months of unstructured time and a truck with 3/4 of a tank. The drive was 40 minutes of confirmation. I passed 2 accidents that weren't accidents. I passed a woman running barefoot on the gravel shoulder carrying a child who wasn't moving. I passed a state trooper's cruiser parked diagonally across both lanes with both doors open, and the light bar still cycling, no trooper visible, and a handprint on the hood that didn't look like it had been made by someone trying to get in. I didn't stop for any of it. I'm telling you this because you need to understand that I wasn't brave. I wasn't strategic. I was a man driving toward the only place he could think of, because thinking had stopped and muscle memory had taken over. I pulled into Station 2's lot at 3:47 p.m. The lot was empty. Engine 4 was gone. On a call, maybe the last call, Ladder 1 was inside. I could see its front bumper through the window in the personnel door. The personnel door was locked. I still had my key. They hadn't asked for it back when they processed me out, or maybe they had, and I'd ignored the letter. I put the key in, and it turned and the deadbolt retracted, and I stepped into the apparatus bay. And the smell hit me. Diesel, rubber. The specific cleaning solution the department buys in 5-gallon buckets from a distributor in New Hampshire. And something behind my unlocked so violently that I had to put my hand on the ladder truck's front tire and breathe. I was home. I had no right to be. And outside, the thing that was ending the world was already closer than I knew. The bay was dim. 2 of the 4 overhead fluorescent banks had been switched off. Conservation habit, institutional muscle memory, someone on the last shift deciding the electric bill still mattered. Ladder 1 sat in the center bay, freshly washed, water spots still drying on the aluminum crossbars of the aerial. I walked the length of it with my hand trailing along the compartment doors, reading the inventory by touch the way I'd done on every rig check for 16 years. Pike poles in the first compartment, Halligans and irons in the second, hydraulic spreaders and rams in the heavy rescue bay at the rear. The portable generator was missing from its mount. Someone had taken it. I didn't clear the building. I should have. That's the first thing. You go room by room. You confirm empty. You secure entry points. I didn't do any of it. I walked upstairs like I was coming on shift. The bunk room had 6 beds. 2 were made. The others had sheets pulled back and left. Someone had left a phone charger plugged into the wall with no phone attached to it. In the kitchen, the coffee maker was on, and the pot was empty, and the heating element had scorched the glass brown. I turned it off. I opened the fridge. Milk, half a case of energy drinks, a Tupperware of something that smelled like chili, condiments. The expiration on the milk was 4 days out. It struck me that in 4 days, expiration dates would be a concept from another civilization. I took the energy drinks. Downstairs, I started doing what I should have done first. The apparatus bay had 3 openings. The 2 large roll-up doors on the front face and the personnel door I'd come through on the east side. There was a back door off the kitchen that opened to a concrete pad where the dumpsters lived. 4 points of entry. The roll-up doors were the vulnerability. They were steel, segmented, motor-driven, and they ran on tracks that were bolted to the door frame but not reinforced beyond their original purpose, which was weather sealing, not security. I hit the wall switches and brought both doors down. They settled onto the concrete slab with a sound I'd heard 10,000 times. The particular metallic groan of Station 2's aging overhead door corporation hardware. The left bay, always a half second behind the right. Then I went to the breaker panel and killed the circuits for the door motors. Nobody was opening those doors with a wall switch now. The personnel door was solid core steel in a steel frame. 1 deadbolt, 1 knob lock. I engaged both and then dragged a tool cabinet in front of it. Not because I thought it would stop anything, but because it would make noise. And noise was information. The kitchen door was weaker. Hollow core, single deadbolt, no frame reinforcement. I took a Halligan bar from the truck. The forked pry bar, an adze combination that every firefighter carries, and I used it to lever the door's hinge pins. I pulled the door off its frame entirely, leaned it against the wall, and replaced the opening with a heavy utility shelving unit from the storage room, tipped on its side and wedged into the frame. Ugly, functional. Someone would have to push through 300 pounds of steel shelving to get in, and they'd have to do it loudly. I was working on adrenaline and something more troubling, satisfaction. The motions were familiar. Rig inventory, structure assessment, hazard mitigation. For 14 months, I'd been filling hours with applications to departments that didn't call back, and shifts at a building supply store where my expertise was confined to helping people choose between 2 grades of deck stain. Now my hands were doing what they were shaped for, and the relief was so acute, it frightened me. I was sealing a building against a catastrophe that was actively killing people I knew. And part of me felt like I'd been given my life back. The radio room was on the 2nd floor, a closet-sized space with the department's base station and a desk. I powered up the Motorola and hit the county frequency. Static. I tried mutual aid. Static. I tried the state emergency channel and got a carrier tone, then a burst of overlapping voices so compressed and panicked they'd merged into a single, unintelligible sound, like a crowd screaming through a drinking straw. I turned the volume down but left it on. Through the 2nd floor windows, I could see Route 9, half a mile south. 2 columns of smoke rose from points I couldn't identify. A helicopter crossed east to west at low altitude, banked, and did not come back. I counted 6 vehicles on the road, moving in different directions, none of them moving at normal speed. And on the sidewalk near the pharmacy, something was walking that wasn't walking right, and it was heading north, which was heading toward me. I didn't sleep that first night. I sat in the bunk room with the lights off, and the window cracked 1 inch, and I listened. Northfield came apart in sound before it came apart in anything else. Between midnight and 3 a.m., I heard 7 distinct gunshot sequences, not single discharges, but clusters. 3 to 6 rounds, the kind of shooting that says I'm aiming at something that keeps coming. I heard car alarms cycle through their repertoires and then stop mid-pattern. I heard what might have been a dog and what was definitely a person, and the difference between those two sounds, at that distance and volume, was not as wide as you'd think. At 4 a.m., something hit the north wall of the station hard enough to rattle the window casings on the second floor. I lay flat on the bunk with a Halligan across my chest and waited. It hit again, then a third time, then nothing. In the morning, I went outside and found a smear at shoulder height on the brick. Not blood, something thicker, darker, and a track in the gravel leading away toward the tree line behind the lot. Whatever it was had come, made contact, and moved on. Not broken in, not tried the doors, just hit the wall 3 times like it was testing whether the building would answer. The station's resources were more substantial than a house, and less substantial than I needed. In the apparatus bay, ladder 1, with its full complement of forcible entry tools, ground ladders, 1,000 feet of hose, and a 500-gallon water tank. The truck's fuel tank was 3/4 full. Diesel, which mattered because the portable pump that fed the water tank ran on diesel too. In the equipment room, 12 SCB, APACs with full air bottles, turnout gear for 8, a thermal imaging camera, a set of battery-powered extrication tools, and rope rescue kits. In the kitchen, enough canned food for maybe 5 days if it was just me, less if it wasn't. The station's water came from the municipal line, which was still pressurized. Electricity was still on. Both of those facts were temporary, and I knew it. I spent the morning on the roof. Station 2 had a flat roof with a low parapet, accessible via the interior stairwell, and a heavy steel hatch that opened outwards. From the roof, I could see 360 degrees of Northfield at a slight elevation. The town sat in a shallow valley, Route 9 bisecting it east to west, the river curling along the southern edge, forested hills rising on 3 sides. I could see the elementary school, the post office, the strip of commercial buildings along Main Street. Smoke was coming from 2 locations, a house on Elm that had burned through its roof overnight, and something larger to the west that I couldn't identify. I saw no fire apparatus responding to either. The streets were mostly empty. Mostly. On Main Street, 3 figures stood in a loose cluster near the hardware store, and I watched them for 10 minutes before I was sure they weren't waiting for the store to open. They weren't talking. They weren't looking at their phones. They were standing with a particular quality of stillness that I recognized from the Citgo station the day before. A stillness that preceded motion without planning it, as if movement was a weather event that happened to them rather than a decision they made. I went back inside and took a pad of paper from the officer's desk and began making lists, not because lists would save me, because the alternative to listing was thinking about Caleb Turner and the woman on the median strip. And the alternative to that was thinking about why I was here and not in Brattleboro. And the alternative to that was thinking about the hearing and what Haggerty said on the stand, and the way Chief Desmond wouldn't look at me when the board read its decision. The radio broke its silence at 11:40 a.m., not the county frequency, not the state channel. A voice on the department's own tactical frequency, the one Station 2 used for on-scene operations, and the voice belonged to someone I knew. Station 2, this is Torrance. Anyone on this channel, please respond. Dana Torrance, 28. 4 years on the job. She'd been a candidate when I was a senior man, and I'd been the one who taught her to throw a ladder. I picked up the handset, and my hand was shaking, and I said, "Dana, this is Ward Ellison. I'm at Station 2. I'm alone. Where are you?" The silence that followed was long enough that I thought I'd lost her. Then, "Ward, How are you? You're not supposed to be there. I know. Are you safe? For now. Where are you? I'm at the bridge on Route 12 with the engine. We've got 4 people. Ward, the department's gone. Dispatch went silent 6 hours ago. Chief's not answering. I don't know what to do. I looked at the apparatus bay, at the tools, at the building around me. Bring them here, I said. They came in on engine 4 at dusk, the diesel stack coughing black exhaust that I could see from the roof before I heard the motor. Dana was driving. She brought the engine straight into the open bay. I'd re-energized the door motor for exactly long enough to raise the left roll-up, standing at the switch with the Halligan in my other hand, while the door climbed its tracks and the outside air came in, carrying a smell that was not the Northfield I remembered. Smoke. Something organic under the smoke. Something that had been warm and was now cooling in the open air of a Vermont September evening. The engine nosed in, and I hit the switch. The door came down, and I killed the circuit again, and we were sealed. Dana climbed out of the cab, looking like she'd aged a decade in 36 hours. Turnout pants, department t-shirt, her hair pulled back with a rubber band that was losing its grip. Her face had the particular flatness I recognized from my worst calls. The expression firefighters wear when they've processed something their vocabulary hasn't caught up to yet. She looked at me, standing in my civilian clothes in her fire station, and I could see the calculation cross her face, the complicated math of a disgraced former colleague, holding a Halligan in the building he'd been removed from. She didn't comment on it. She said, "We need to get them inside." Them. 4 people, Dana had said on the radio. 4 people climbed off engine 4 in the following order. A man in his 50s named Gil Reeves, who wore a postal carrier's uniform and had a gash across his forearm that someone had wrapped with gauze from the engine's first aid kit. A woman named Priya Chakrabarti, mid-30s, still in scrubs. She was an intake nurse at the urgent care clinic on Route 9, and she had been walking to her car when the clinic's parking lot became something she described only as not survivable. And 2 teenagers, Marcus and Elena Webb, siblings 16 and 14, who had been waiting for their mother to pick them up from school when their mother didn't come. Dana had collected them one by one over the course of the day while responding to calls that no dispatcher was sending, driving engine 4 through streets she'd trained on with a crew of 1 because her crew was gone and the chain of command had dissolved into radio silence. I set up the bunk room. 6 beds, 6 of us. The arithmetic was clean, at least. Priya looked at Gil's arm under the fluorescent light and said the wound was superficial. Not a bite. A laceration from a car door he'd forced to open, trying to reach a customer on his route. She cleaned and redressed it with supplies from the engine's medical kit. I watched her hands while she worked. They were steady. Mine were not. And I kept them in my pockets so nobody would see. We gathered in the kitchen. I'd heated the chili from the Tupperware and opened 2 cans of soup and set out everything I'd found. The energy drinks, a box of granola bars from the captain's office, a bag of apples from someone's locker. It was the first shared meal of whatever this was becoming, and it was silent for the first 3 minutes. Elena ate like someone who hadn't eaten since it started. Marcus ate like someone who wasn't sure he should. Gil held his spoon in his left hand because his right arm hurt and stared at the table. Priya ate methodically, small bites, watching the rest of us the way I imagined she watched patients in triage, sorting by acuity. Dana broke the silence. "The department's gone, Ward. Gone. I tried every house, every cell. I drove past the chief's place on Route 12 and the front door was open and the dog was loose and nobody was inside. I tried the mutual aid frequency and got Greenfield once. They were evacuating their station, heading south. They didn't say where. That was 8 hours ago. I haven't raised anyone since." "What about broader emergency management?" Priya asked. "State? National Guard? The state channel's been a mess since yesterday. I heard someone say the Guard was mobilizing at the Burlington Armory. But that's 90 miles, and I have no idea if it's real." Gil spoke for the first time since arriving. The mail stopped. I know that sounds stupid, but I've been carrying mail for 27 years, and the mail has never stopped. The trucks didn't come this morning. The regional sort facility didn't answer. That's a federal system. If the federal system stops, the federal government has bigger problems than us. He was right, and everyone at the table knew it. The silence that followed his observation had a different texture. Not shock, but recognition. This was not a disruption that would be corrected. This was not a storm that would pass. The machinery that organized our lives had seized, and we were sitting in one of its outbuildings eating canned soup while the seizure spread. Marcus said, "Are they going to find our mom?" Nobody answered. Dana looked at me. I looked at the table. The honest answer was that nobody was looking for anyone's mother, including their own. The kind answer was something else, and I didn't have it. "We're going to figure this out," Dana said. "One thing at a time." It was the best anyone could do, and it wasn't enough. And Marcus knew it. I told Dana about the hearing on the second night. Not because she asked. She knew the broad strokes already. Everyone on the department did. But because she was going to be making decisions with me, and she deserved to know who she was making them with. We were on the roof, both of us looking north, watching a line of car headlights on the state highway that formed, stuttered, and went dark one by one, like a string of bulbs burning out. Below us, the station was quiet. Gil was sleeping. Priya was inventorying the medical supplies. Marcus and Elena were in the bunk room with the door closed. And I could hear Elena crying through the floor in the way that teenagers cry when they're trying to be inaudible, which makes the sound worse. "The call was a structure fire on Pearl Street," I said. 2-story residential, fully involved on arrival. Report of occupants trapped, 2nd floor. I was the officer on Engine 4 that night. I made the decision to send a crew interior for a primary search. Dana didn't say anything. She knew this part. The floor collapsed 90 seconds after entry. Justin Kerrigan fell through to the basement. He broke his back. The fire burned over him for 4 minutes before we could cut a path to get him out. He'll be in a wheelchair for the rest of his life. The headlights on the highway were all dark now. The board found that I had sufficient indicators of structural compromise to have gone defensive. The read was correct. The 2nd floor joists had been charcoal for a minimum of 8 minutes before we arrived. I should have seen it. I should have read the smoke. I did see it. I read the smoke wrong. Not recklessly. I believed what I saw, and what I saw was wrong. And believing it put Justin through a floor. "The board pulled your certification," Dana said. "Suspended, indefinitely, with a review path I was never going to pass because the review board included Haggerty, and Haggerty was Justin's lieutenant. And Haggerty decided the day it happened that I'd acted with negligence, and no amount of process was going to change his mind. Was it negligence? I'd asked myself that question every day for 14 months. It was a mistake, a bad one. I don't know if there's a meaningful difference." Dana was quiet for a long time. Then she said something I hadn't expected. "I'm glad you're here, Ward. I need someone who's made a bad call and lived with it. Everyone in my class got trained to follow the manual. Nobody trained us for when the manual's gone." Below us, something moved in the tree line at the back of the parking lot. We both saw it. A figure, indistinct in the darkness, moving laterally along the edge of the paved surface. It paused. It angled its head. Not turned, angled. The whole upper body tilting as a unit, as if its neck was a fixed column and the rotation had to come from the waist. Then it continued east and disappeared behind the post office. "They're getting closer," Dana said. "They've been passing through since I got here. They don't seem interested in the building. Yet. We went back inside. In the kitchen, Priya had laid out the medical inventory on the table. The engine's first aid kit, the station's first aid cabinet. What she'd had in her scrub pockets when she left the clinic. It was enough for wound care and basic stabilization. It was nowhere near enough for what she was clearly already anticipating. "I need to ask something uncomfortable," she said when we sat down. "What's the plan if someone gets bitten?" Dana and I looked at each other. Neither of us had spoken the word yet. The thing happening outside had no official name in our conversations, no taxonomy, no framework. We'd been treating it as a crisis, a natural disaster, a civil collapse, something with an emergency management playbook, even if the playbook was disrupted. Priya's question reframed it. "I've treated 3 bite patients since yesterday," she continued, "at the clinic before it fell apart. All 3 presented identically. Fever onset within 30 minutes. Cognitive decline within 2 hours. Motor pattern alteration within 4. By 6 hours, they were no longer responsive to verbal stimuli. By 8, they were..." She stopped. Started again. "By 8, they had joined the problem. I don't have a treatment. I don't have a theory. I have a timeline." 8 hours, I said. "At most. So if someone gets bitten, then we have 8 hours to decide what kind of people we are." Nobody touched that sentence. It sat on the table between us like an unexploded device, and we left it there and talked about water pressure and food supply and watch schedules instead. And it was still sitting there when I went to bed. And it's still sitting there now. The 3rd day brought 2 things. The first serious test of the station's perimeter, and a visitor who wasn't infected. The test came at dawn. I was on roof watch. We'd established a rotation, 4-hour shifts, 2 people always awake. And I saw them coming from the south in a loose cluster of 8 or 9, moving up Route 9 at the particular pace I'd learned to recognize. Not running, a metronomic mid-tempo that never varied and never tired. They weren't following anything. They weren't heading anywhere with purpose. They were moving, because moving was what they did now. And the fire station was in their path the way a rock is in a stream's path. The first one reached the parking lot and continued across it without pausing. The second did the same. The third stopped. It turned toward the station, the full-body rotation Priya and I had started calling the pivot, and stood in the lot, 15 feet from the apparatus bay doors, and looked at the building. I use the word looked because I don't have a better one. But what it was doing with its eyes didn't resemble looking in any way I can describe as human. It was receiving the building, taking it in as information, and then it walked forward and put its hands flat on the roll-up door and pushed. The door held. Of course it held. It was still on steel tracks with the motor circuit dead, which meant the door was resting on its own weight plus mechanical resistance. A person couldn't push a roll-up door open from outside under those conditions. And whatever this had been before, its body was still a person's body with a person's mechanical limits. It pushed. It stopped. It pushed again. The door flexed a 1/4 inch inward and rang like a drum skin. And the sound filled the apparatus bay below me, and I heard Gil shout from the bunk room. The rest of the cluster was passing. The one at the door pushed a 3rd time, then released, then pivoted away and rejoined the stream heading north. And within 4 minutes, the lot was empty and the morning was quiet again. I came downstairs to find everyone awake and Dana already at the bay doors inspecting the point of contact. "The track bolts held," she said. "But this door was designed to keep weather out, not to take lateral force. If we get a bigger group, or if they push together, they don't coordinate," I said. "They don't coordinate yet." That word again. The word that kept appending itself to every observation. I pulled the ladder truck's ground ladders from their mounts. 2 24-foot aluminum extension ladders, 1 14-foot roof ladder. And we used them as horizontal braces across the roll-up doors, wedging the butt ends into the floor drains and the tips into the door tracks. It turned the doors from passive barriers into triangulated structures that would distribute force laterally into the masonry walls. Dana watched me work and said, "You're treating the door like a collapse zone. I'm treating the door like a structural element under load. That's what it is now. That's not what it was built to be. Nothing is what it was built to be anymore." We were still securing the second bay door when we heard the sound from outside. Not the metronomic shuffle of the infected, but a rapid, irregular knocking on the personnel door. Knocking. With rhythm. With pattern. Pause. Knock, knock, knock. A human pattern. A pattern that expected an answer. I moved the tool cabinet away from the door. I held the Halligan. Dana stood behind me with a pike pole. I opened the deadbolt, then the knob lock, and pulled the door open 6 inches and looked through the gap at a man I had never seen before. And the man looked at me and said, "Please, I have a truck. I have supplies. I just need walls." His name was Oren Matej. He was 53. He was a mechanical engineer who had been driving from Albany to Montreal for a consulting job when the highways closed. He had a Ford F-250 with a camper shell, and in the bed of that truck he had 200 pounds of tools, a portable welding rig, a 50-gallon water bladder, 3 cases of canned food, a shortwave radio, and a 12-gauge shotgun with 40 shells. He offered all of it in exchange for a door that locked. Dana looked at me. We let him in. Oren changed the station in 72 hours. Not politically, not socially. Physically, the man had a mechanical engineer's relationship to problems, which meant he saw every surface, every joint, every material as an invitation to be reconfigured. By the morning after his arrival, he had assessed every entry point, every load-bearing wall, every utility penetration in the building, and drawn a diagram on the kitchen whiteboard that looked like an X-ray of the station's skeleton. "Your bay doors are your critical vulnerability," he said, pointing with a dry erase marker while the rest of us ate breakfast. "You've braced them, which is smart. But bracing resists force. It doesn't eliminate the opening. What we need is to make the opening not exist." He proposed welding the bay doors shut. Not barricading, not bracing, welding, running a continuous bead along the bottom edge where the door met the concrete slab. Then tack welding the side tracks to the door panels every 18 inches to create a single, rigid plane. The doors would never open again. Ladder 1 would never leave the bay. The truck's operational life was over, and its value would be entirely as a parts depot. Tools, hose, water, air bottles, diesel fuel siphoned from its tank. "You're killing the truck," Dana said. Her voice was neutral, but her hands were flat on the table, pressing down. "The truck's already dead," Oren replied. "There's nowhere to drive it. There's no dispatch to send it. What's alive is the water in its tank, and the diesel in its fuel system, and the steel in its compartment doors. And all of those things serve you better if the bay they're sitting in is sealed." He was right, and Dana knew it. And I watched her process the loss. Not of equipment, but of identity. Ladder 1 was what remained of the Northfield Fire Department. It was the last physical proof that the institution had existed, that the job she'd trained for was real, that the skills she'd spent 4 years acquiring had a purpose larger than personal survival. Welding those bay doors shut meant welding shut the possibility that any of that would come back. "Do it," she said. Oren welded. The sound filled the station. The crackle and hiss of the MIG welder, the sharp ozone smell, the blue-white light that threw shadows on the walls that jumped and froze and jumped again. Marcus held the welding shield for him, while Oren ran the bead. Elena watched from the stairs with her arms wrapped around herself. Gil stood outside on a supply run that Priya had insisted on. We needed medications from the pharmacy on Main Street, and Gil had volunteered because his mail route had taken him past that pharmacy 6 days a week for 2 decades, and he said he could get there and back in 40 minutes with his eyes closed. He was gone for 3 hours. When he came back, his postal uniform was torn at the shoulder, and he had a pharmacy bag with 6 bottles of antibiotics, 2 bottles of ibuprofen, a box of sutures, and a look on his face that told us the 40-minute round trip had included something he wasn't going to talk about. Priya took the supplies. Dana took Gil to the kitchen and gave him water and sat with him until his hands stopped shaking. I stayed downstairs, watching Oren weld. listening to the sound of the fire station becoming something that was no longer a fire station. By that evening, both bay doors were sealed. Oren had reinforced the personnel door with angle iron welded to the frame and added a second deadbolt fabricated from a piece of the ladder truck's outrigger pin. The kitchen door, the one I'd removed and replaced with a shelving unit, he rebuilt entirely, hanging a steel plate he cut from one of the truck's compartment doors and welding hinges from his own stock. When he was done, Station 2 had 4 entry points, and all 4 of them were steel on steel in masonry with redundant locking. "Now," he said, wiping the welding soot from his face with a rag, "we talk about the roof." The roof was our only remaining soft point. The steel hatch was solid, but the roof membrane itself was rubber over plywood over joists. Anything that got onto the roof could theoretically break through. Oren's solution was to keep the roof accessible and defended rather than sealed, because the roof was also our best asset. Observation, communication, ventilation, and, as he pointed out, potential solar gain if we could salvage panels from anywhere in the town. "You're thinking long-term," I said. "I'm thinking about what happens when the power grid fails. 12 days, maybe less." I hadn't been thinking that far ahead. I'd been thinking in shifts and meals and perimeter checks, the operational rhythm of an active incident where the next hour is the planning horizon. Oren was thinking in weeks, in infrastructure, in systems. "You've done this before," Dana said. Not a question. Oren shook his head. "I've spent 30 years designing buildings that keep water out and heat in, and people comfortable. The principles don't change. The threat model does." That night, I lay in my bunk and listened to the station settle around me and tried to identify what had shifted. It wasn't just the physical changes, though those were real. It was that the building had acquired a second author. I'd been treating the station as mine. My key, my knowledge, my muscle memory, my instinct that brought me here. Oren was treating it as a problem to be solved, and his solutions were permanently altering the structure I'd known. The station I'd walked into 3 days ago was already gone. What was replacing it was better. Harder, tighter, more survivable. But it was not mine. I was not the architect of this place. I was just the one who'd brought the key. The power grid failed on day 9. Not gradually. A hard cutoff at 2:17 a.m. that dropped the station into absolute darkness and silence so total that my first thought was that I'd gone deaf. The refrigerators, the baseband hiss of the radio died. The clock on the microwave went black. Every ambient electronic sound that I'd been filtering out for 9 days ceased simultaneously. And what remained was the building itself. The creak of thermal contraction, the tick of cooling pipes, and 6 people breathing in the dark. Oren had prepared for this. The truck's generator, the one that had been missing from its mount when I arrived. He'd found a replacement at the hardware store in one of Gil's supply runs, a Honda E U2200i. Fuel efficient, relatively quiet. He'd pre-positioned it on the roof with a fuel line running to a 10-gallon jerry can and a power cable snaked down through the hatch and into a junction box he'd wired into the station's electrical panel. By 2:40 a.m., we had lights in the kitchen and power to the radio and the medical refrigerator Priya had designated for temperature-sensitive supplies. Everything else stayed dark. "We run it 4 hours on, 8 hours off," Oren said. "The fuel math gives us 36 days at that rate. After that, we're dark unless we find more." 36 days. I wrote the number on the whiteboard next to Oren's structural diagram. It joined a growing column of numbers that defined our existence. 6 people, 4 entry points, 53 cans of food, 22 gallons of water in the truck's bladder plus municipal pressure that was declining daily, 40 shotgun shells, 8 SCBA bottles at 4,000 PS1 each. And now, 36 days of intermittent electricity. The numbers were a vocabulary. They described a sentence we couldn't yet read in full. The loss of grid power changed the town's soundscape, without the electrical hum that underlies every American settlement. The transformer buzz, the compressor cycles, the cumulative drone of 1,000 appliances, Northfield became acoustically naked. Sounds carried differently. From the roof, I could hear individual footsteps at distances I couldn't have heard before. I could distinguish between the infected's metronomic pace and the irregular gait of an animal. Deer were moving through town freely now, grazing on the lawns of houses whose owners were gone. I could hear water, the river to the south, louder than it had any right to be, as if the loss of human noise had given it permission to reassert itself. On day 11, the municipal water pressure dropped to a trickle and then stopped. We'd been filling every available container since day 3. Orrin had insisted, and we had approximately 80 gallons stockpiled in a mix of the water bladder, cooking pots, cleaned fuel cans, and the ladder truck's 500-gallon booster tank, which he'd rigged a hand pump to access. 580 gallons for 6 people. At a gallon per person per day for drinking and basic hygiene, we had roughly 90 days, enough to plan, not enough to be careless. Water reshaped our behavior more profoundly than I'd anticipated. We stopped washing dishes and started wiping them. We stopped flushing toilets and started using the dumpster pad outside, which required opening the reinforced kitchen door. The most dangerous 60 seconds of anyone's day. We stopped thinking of water as a utility and started thinking of it as a material, precious and countable. Each use a subtraction from a total that only went in one direction. Priya established medical protocols based on the new constraints. Wound cleaning used a measured amount. She'd calculated a minimum effective volume for each wound type and posted a chart in the kitchen. Oral hydration was tracked per person. She kept a log. I saw her writing in it by flashlight during the generator's off hours, her pen moving in precise lines across the page, converting our consumption into data. And I recognized the behavior because it was my behavior. The compulsion to organize the uncontrollable into columns and lists, to make the catastrophe legible, even if legibility didn't make it survivable. On day 12, Elena came to me on the roof during my watch shift. She hadn't said more than a dozen words since arriving, and her brother Marcus had become her interpreter, relaying her needs, her observations, her rare requests. She stood next to me at the parapet and looked out at the town she'd grown up in, and she said, "Mr. Ellison, do you think my mom is one of them?" I didn't answer right away. I'd learned in 16 years of fire service that the wrong kind of speed in answering a hard question is worse than silence. "I don't know, Elena. Marcus keeps telling me she's somewhere safe. He keeps saying that. But he doesn't believe it. I can tell because he says it exactly the same way every time. He memorized it. Your brother loves you. That's what he's doing when he says that." I know. But I'd rather know the truth and be sad than not know and be this. She gestured at herself. Her whole body, the hunched shoulders, the bitten nails, the circles under her eyes. This, the state of suspension, the condition of not knowing, which was not grief and not hope, but the space between them where neither could take root, and both kept scratching at the walls. I had nothing to give her. No intelligence, no comfort, no professional competence that applied. She was 14 years old, and she was asking me to confirm that her mother was dead, or confirm that her mother was alive, and I could do neither, and the inability sat in my chest like a stone. "If I learn anything," I said, "you'll be the first person I tell, not Marcus. You." She nodded. She went back inside. The stone stayed where it was. Day 16 brought the first serious disagreement, and it wasn't about resources or security or any of the things I'd expected it to fracture us. It was about the radio. Orrin's shortwave had been our only connection to anything beyond Northfield since the department's Motorola base station went silent on day 7. The repeater tower that served the county frequency had apparently lost power or been damaged, and without it, Our VHF radios were limited to line of sight, which in a valley surrounded by forested hills meant about a mile. The shortwave could reach farther, and Oren had been monitoring it every evening during our generator hours, scanning frequencies, logging what he heard. Most of it was noise. Some of it was fragments, a voice in Spanish reading numbers, a ham operator in Pennsylvania describing conditions that matched ours, a looping automated message from what claimed to be FEMA, directing survivors to a processing center in Hartford, Connecticut, 200 miles south. The disagreement was about whether to transmit. Gil wanted to. He'd become fixated on the FEMA message, listening to it loop after loop, writing down the details, the address, the frequency for further contact, the promised services. They're organizing, he said. They're out there and they're organizing and they need to know we're here. Oren opposed it. Transmitting gives our position, not just to FEMA, to everyone with a receiver. We don't know who's listening. We don't know what's between here and Hartford. A broadcast that says 6 survivors with supplies at a fortified position is an invitation to anyone who hears it. You're describing people as threats, Gil said. I'm describing reality. Your reality. Some of us still believe there's a functioning government trying to help. Some of us believe that because the alternative is too frightening to accept. The kitchen went quiet. Gil's jaw tightened. Priya, who had been monitoring the exchange with her triage attentiveness, intervened before it escalated. Both positions have merit. The question isn't whether to transmit. The question is what to say and how much it reveals. Dana proposed a compromise. We would transmit on the FEMA frequency, identify ourselves as survivors in southern Vermont, request information about the Hartford Processing Center, and not disclose our exact location, our numbers, or our supplies. Gil accepted. Oren didn't like it, but didn't block it. We transmitted that evening. The response came 3 days later. Not from FEMA, from a woman named Carolyn on a ham frequency adjacent to the one we'd used, who had triangulated our general area from our signal and wanted to tell us 2 things. First, the Hartford Processing Center had been overrun a week ago, and the FEMA message was an automated loop that nobody was maintaining. Second, she was part of a loose network of shortwave operators across New England who were sharing intelligence, mapping safe routes, and coordinating resource exchanges between survivor groups. She called it the mesh. She gave us a schedule of frequencies and times. She asked nothing in return except that we listen and, when we could, share what we knew. Gil took the Hartford news like a blow to the chest. He sat in the bunk room for 2 hours afterward, and nobody went in after him because there was nothing to say. The institution he'd believed in, the one he'd carried mail for, the one whose flag he'd raised at the post office every morning for 27 years, had reduced to an automated recording playing to no one. The mesh was something different. Over the following week, Dana and I monitored the scheduled broadcasts and built a picture of the region that was fragmented and horrifying and, in narrow channels, functional. Survivor groups had established positions in schools, churches, warehouses, farms. Some were static. Some were mobile. Some had already failed. Their last transmissions logged by the mesh operators and preserved as data, as evidence that they had existed. The pattern that emerged was not a map of rescue. It was a map of archipelago. Islands of survival in a sea of loss, each island maintaining itself, some reaching toward others. Carolyn asked, on our 4th contact, what our position's capabilities were. Dana described the station, the sealed structure, the water reserve, the medical capacity. There was a pause, and then Carolyn said, "You should know that you're one of the more intact positions we've logged in your region. There are 2 groups within 50 miles that are in worse shape. One of them has children." She let that sit. I looked at Dana. Dana looked at me. The question Carolyn hadn't asked was loud enough to fill the kitchen. Were we a destination? Saying yes to that question changed us more than the outbreak had. Not because the people who came were dangerous or difficult. Most were neither. But because every arrival forced a recalculation that went deeper than food and water math. Every new person brought a gap in the wall that had to be sealed. A body that consumed resources, a set of skills that might or might not offset their cost, and a history that entered our space, whether we wanted it or not. The first group arrived on day 23. A family of 3 from Greenfield, Massachusetts, a couple named Sam and Deb Willette, and their 7-year-old son, Theo. They'd driven north on Carolyn's guidance, following a route the mesh had mapped as passable, and they arrived in a minivan with a quarter tanks of gas and almost nothing else. They had fled their home on day 2 and had been moving since, sleeping in their car, eating whatever they found. Theo had a cough that Priya diagnosed as the early stage of a respiratory infection compounded by malnutrition and exhaustion. Oren tracked me down on the roof while the Ouellettes were eating their first real meal in the kitchen below. "We need to talk about capacity," he said. "We have capacity. We have capacity for 6. We're now 9. The water math changes. The food math changes. The space math changes. We have 6 bunks. We'll add bedding onto the floor. That's not the point. The point is that every person we take in accelerates the timeline on every resource we have. At the current rate, with 9 people, our water drops from 90 days to 60. Our food drops from 40 days to 26. The generator fuel is unaffected because we're already rationing it. But everything biological, everything we eat, drink, and metabolize, compresses. I know the math, Oren. Then you know that if Carolyn sends another group and another after that, we reach a point where the fortress you built and I hardened becomes a container for a slower kind of dying. Not from infection, from arithmetic. He wasn't wrong. He also wasn't proposing a solution. He was naming the problem and waiting for me to acknowledge it. And I understood why. Oren was an engineer. Engineers don't make policy. They define parameters and present constraints, and let someone in Toros make the decision that lives inside those constraints. He was handing me the decision. "We keep taking people," I said. "To what limit?" "I don't know yet." "Ward, I need a number." "You'll get one." "Not today." He left. I stayed on the roof and looked at the town and thought about numbers. Not Oren's numbers. The logistics, the resource depletion curves, the carrying capacity of a 1931 brick fire station in a Vermont valley. Different numbers. The number of beds I'd filled on overnight shifts. The number of calls I'd run in 16 years. The number of people I'd pulled from cars and carried down ladders and ventilated on the floor of the apparatus bay while the ambulance was en route. 231. I knew the number because I'd kept count, which was a vanity I'd never admitted to anyone. And the reason I kept count was that the count was the only metric I had for whether my life had mattered. 231 people who were alive, because I'd showed up, -1, minus Justin Kerrigan, who was in a wheelchair because I'd read the smoke wrong. 230 net. The math of what we owed was not the math Oren was doing. Oren was calculating sustainability. I was calculating obligation. Both calculations were valid. They produced different answers. Over the following 2 weeks, 5 more people arrived, some via the mesh, some on their own, drawn by the smoke from our generator exhaust or the light visible from the second-floor windows during our power hours. A retired electrician from Brattleboro who immediately became essential when he identified a wiring fault in Oren's generator hookup that could have started a fire. A young couple from a farm in Guilford who brought 30 pounds of dried beans and a knowledge of food preservation that Priya integrated into our rationing system within a day. A woman named Ruth, 60s, alone, who said almost nothing about where she'd come from but carried a pair of binoculars and posted herself on the roof without being asked, and became, within 3 days, the most reliable watch we had. 14 people. The station groaned with them, not structurally. Oren's modifications held, the walls were sound. The sealed bay doors bore no strain beyond their own weight. The groaning was human. 14 people in a building designed for a crew of 8. sharing 6 bunks in rotation, sharing a single bathroom, sharing a kitchen that became a constant low-level negotiation of space and timing and personal boundary. The smell alone was a crisis. 14 bodies, limited water for washing, a dumpster pad latrine that required an armed escort to use. Priya established hygiene protocols that helped. Nothing eliminated the fundamental fact that we were too many for the space and getting more numerous. Oren presented his number on day 31. He'd drafted a formal assessment, carrying capacity of the facility based on water, food, space, and sanitation. And the number was 18. 18 people could survive in Station 2 for 6 months if we maintained strict rationing and executed regular supply runs. We were at 14. 4 more. And after 18, Donna asked. After 18, someone has to leave. The table was quiet. Ruth, who never spoke in group discussions, spoke now. Or we find more water. Everyone looked at her. The river, she said. It's 400 yards south. It's flowing. If you can filter it, your water constraint disappears and your carrying capacity doubles. Oren stared at her. Then he picked up his marker and went to the whiteboard and started recalculating. The river was 400 yards south, and it might as well have been 400 miles. Between Station 2 and the riverbank lay a stretch of town that we'd been watching from the roof for a month, and that had become, gradually and then suddenly, the densest concentration of infected movement in our visible area. They gravitated toward the water. We'd noticed it in week 2. A trickle of figures moving south through the streets, converging on the river's edge, standing in the shallows. By week 4, it was a permanent congregation. Priya theorized that degraded thermoregulation drove them to cool their core temperature. Oren said it didn't matter why. What mattered was that the thing we needed most was surrounded by the thing that would kill us. We needed a path to the river that avoided the main streets. Gil, whose postal route had taken him through every alley and backyard in Northfield, sketched one from memory. East out the personnel door, through the parking lot of the post office, down the service alley behind the commercial block on Main Street, through a gap in the fence behind the Methodist church, across the church's rear lot, and down a wooded slope to the riverbank at a point upstream from the bridge where the infected density was lower. 1,100 yards, a winding concealed route that used buildings and terrain as visual cover. The supply run team, Dana and Marcus, who had become her partner on every exterior mission since week 2, walked it on day 33. They left at dawn during the period Priya had identified as the lowest activity window based on Ruth's roof logs. Ruth tracked them through the binoculars, relaying their progress to me at the radio. They reached the river in 22 minutes. They filled 4 5-gallon containers and started back. They returned in 31 minutes, the extra time because Marcus had to set down the jugs twice to rest. 40 gallons for 53 minutes of exposure. The math worked if we could repeat it regularly. The risk worked if nothing changed. Things changed on the 4th run. Dana and Marcus were at the river filling containers when a group of 12 infected emerged from the tree line on the opposite bank. They didn't cross. The water was waist deep at that point, and the current was significant. But they stood on the far bank in the pivot stance, receiving Dana and Marcus the way the one in our parking lot had received the station on day 3. Then 3 of them waded in, not crossing, testing, feeling the current against their legs and calibrating something that none of us wanted to name. Dana pulled Marcus back. They left 2 full containers on the bank and ran the route home in 14 minutes and came through the personnel door, breathing hard and pale. They're learning the water, Dana said. They're not learning, Oren countered. They're responding to stimulus. The current pushes them and they adjust. That's not cognition, it's reflex. Reflex doesn't explain why they waited until we were there. They came out of the tree line when they heard us filling the jugs. They oriented on the sound. Then they entered the water. That's a sequence. Stimulus, orientation, approach. In my academy, we called that a threat recognition pattern. The room divided. Not formally, not with raised voices, but along a line that had been forming since the first week. On one side, Orrin and Gil and the retired electrician, people who needed the infected to be mechanisms, systems of stimulus and response, predictable and therefore manageable. On the other, Donna and Priya and Ruth, people who had observed enough to suspect that predictability was a phase, not a condition, and that what the infected were doing was not random but developmental. I stood on the line. I'd been standing on it since day one. The officer's position, between the people who need certainty and the people who are watching certainty dissolve. We modify the route, I said. We find a second access point to the river, upstream, where the bank is steeper and the approach is harder. We alternate between the 2 points, so we never establish a pattern they can orient on. And we double the watch. Ruth on the roof with binoculars and someone at the halfway point as relay. It was a compromise. It was also a tacit acknowledgement that Dana was right. We were adjusting our behavior to account for the possibility that the infected were adjusting theirs. That meant something I wasn't ready to say out loud. We ran the modified route for 2 weeks. It worked. We accumulated water. Orrin built a filtration system from sand, gravel, and activated charcoal scavenged from a pet store's aquarium supply aisle. Priya tested the output by drinking it herself and waiting 24 hours before clearing it for general use. The water constraint relaxed. The carrying capacity expanded. Ruth's number, the one she'd thrown out in that single sentence during Orrin's presentation, had been correct, and its correctness had changed everything. On day 47, Carolyn came on the shortwave with news that redefined the landscape. "There's a column moving north through the Connecticut Valley," Carolyn said. Her voice was steady. She was always steady, which was either discipline or dissociation, and from 100 miles away, I couldn't tell which. Not infected. People, armed, organized. They've been absorbing settlements south of Springfield. Not attacking. Absorbing. They show up, they offer protection, they integrate your people and your supplies into their column, and they keep moving. The settlements that refuse get left alone, but the settlements that join don't come back out. "How large?" Dana asked. Initial reports said 50. The latest count from a mesh operator in Northampton who watched them pass was closer to 300. They're growing because every stop makes them bigger. Military? No insignia, no uniforms. Some military hardware. 2 vehicles that sound like Humvees from the descriptions, but the structure is ad hoc. One operator described it as a feudal levy. A core group of armed leaders with a growing train of absorbed civilians who work for protection. How fast are they moving? 20 miles a day. They passed through Brattleboro yesterday. 20 miles a day. Brattleboro was 20 miles south. The arithmetic was so simple it didn't need a whiteboard. I called a meeting. All 14 of us in the kitchen, standing room only. The generator running so we had light. I relayed Carolyn's information without editorializing. Then I opened the floor. The discussion lasted 2 hours. It was the most honest conversation we'd had since the beginning, because it forced everyone to articulate what they believed about the nature of our position. Not the tactical question of how to defend or whether to negotiate, but the foundational question of what Station 2 was. Was it a refuge? A place to endure until the crisis resolved? Was it a home? A place to build a life in? Was it a waypoint? A temporary position that served us until a better option appeared? The answer determined the response. A refuge holds, a home defends, a waypoint yields. Orrin argued for defense. He'd spent 47 days hardening this building, and he believed in its capability. We have sealed walls, water access, food supply, medical capacity, communications. We've solved the problems that kill most groups. A column of 300 people moving through is a weather event. We close the shutters, we go dark, we wait for it to pass. Gil argued for engagement. 300 people with military vehicles and organization. That's the closest thing to a functioning society we've encountered. Maybe they're dangerous. Maybe they're not. But hiding from the largest group of living humans in this region because we're afraid of what they might do is the same logic that would have kept every person at this table outside our door. Dana argued for neither and both. We need information before we decide. We don't know their intentions, their leadership, their terms. We need a contact that doesn't expose us. A conversation at distance, where we can break it off if it goes wrong. Marcus, who had grown from a silent 16-year-old into the most competent field operator we had, said, "I can get close enough to look at them without them seeing me. I've been running the river route for 4 weeks. I know the terrain south of here better than anyone." "No," I said. The word came out harder than I intended. Marcus looked at me, and I saw something shift in his expression. The recognition that I'd responded not as an operational lead assessing a proposal, but as an adult refusing a child, and that the refusal was rooted in something older than tactics. "I'm not a kid, Ward." "I know you're not. Then let me do what I'm good at." Elena, sitting next to her brother, said nothing. Her face said everything. I proposed a compromise that wasn't really a compromise. Dana and I would move south on the supply route to a concealed observation point overlooking Route 9, assess the column as it passed, and make contact only if the assessment warranted it. Marcus would stay at the station and run the watch. He didn't like it. He accepted it because Donna backed me. And Dana's authority with Marcus was the one thing in this building that functioned without negotiation. We left before dawn on day 48. We moved south through Gill's Route, past the Methodist Church, past the riverbank access point, and into a stretch of town I hadn't entered since arriving. The commercial block south of Main Street was gutted. Windows broken, doors open, the particular desolation of buildings that had been entered and emptied and abandoned in sequence. We set up on the second floor of an insurance office with a clear sight line to Route 9 at the point where it entered Northfield from the south. Then we waited. The column arrived at noon. Carolyn's description was accurate and insufficient. What came up Route 9 was not an army, and not a mob, and not a convoy. It was a migration. At the front, a knot of armed men and women, maybe 30, moving with the alert spacing of people who'd been doing this long enough to develop doctrine. Behind them, vehicles. 2 Humvees, a school bus, a collection of pickup trucks, and SUVs loaded high. Behind the vehicles, on foot, the rest. Civilians, families, individuals, walking in a stream that stretched back farther than I could see from our position. They carried packs, pulled wagons, pushed shopping carts. Children walked between adults. A dog trotted alongside a woman who carried a rifle across her shoulders like a yoke. They were not what I'd feared. They were also not what Gil had hoped. They were something in between. A human system that had formed under pressure and was moving because standing still had killed everyone who tried it. A man at the front of the armed group raised a hand. The column stopped. He was looking at the fire station. They saw the welds on the bay doors. That's what caught the lead man's attention, Oren's beadwork, which from the street was clearly visible as post-factory modification. Sealed bay doors on a fire station meant occupation. Occupation meant resources. Resources meant a conversation. And the man who walked across the parking lot toward our building while Dana and I watched from the insurance office 3 blocks south was not asking permission. He knocked on the personnel door. He knocked the way a person knocks. Rhythmed, patient, expecting an answer. Inside, 14 people were holding their breath. We briefed them before leaving. If someone approaches, do not respond. Do not make sound. Do not open the door. Oren was in charge. The protocol was silence. The man knocked again. Then he stepped back and looked up at the roof. Ruth was up there. She'd stayed at her post. And later she told me that he looked directly at her. Not searching, but finding. As if he already knew someone was watching. He held up both hands. Open palms. Then he walked back to the column, and the column began to move again. flowing past Station 2 like a current around a stone, and within 30 minutes, they were through the center of town and continuing north. Dana and I didn't move for an hour after the last of them passed. Then we worked our way back to the station through the alley road and came through the personnel door into a building thrumming with the particular energy of a crisis that didn't arrive. "They left," Gil said, and his voice was saturated with an emotion I couldn't immediately identify. Disappointment. The column he'd argued to engage had assessed us and moved on, and we were still alone, and the society he'd imagined joining hadn't wanted us badly enough to insist. "They'll be back," Oren said, "or someone like them. We're on Route 9. Every group that moves through this valley will see us, and every group that sees us will make the same calculation that man just made. Is this position worth the effort of taking? We need to make sure the answer stays no." This was Dana speaking, and what she said next was the fulcrum on which the next phase of our existence turned. We need to stop being a fortress. Fortresses attract siege. We need to be a service, something that's more valuable running than captured. The room waited. Priya's clinic, Oren's fabrication capability, the mesh relay we've been operating, Gil's route knowledge, Ward's structural expertise. We have things that other groups need and can't replicate. If we offer those things voluntarily, if we become a node that people pass through rather than a prize they try to crack open, then our security comes from our utility, not our walls. It was the most radical thing anyone had proposed since we'd sealed the building, and it was radical because it inverted everything we'd done. Every weld, every brace, every sealed door, every darkened window. All of it designed to make us invisible and impenetrable. Dana was proposing to reverse, not to dismantle the defenses, to open them selectively, to let the world in on our terms, in measured doses, through a controlled interface. Oren hated it. "You're proposing we advertise our position to every armed group in the region. I'm proposing we make our position too useful to attack. That theory works until someone decides they want your usefulness working for them instead of for everyone. Then we'll deal with that when it happens. Right now, the theory that's failing is the one where we hide behind steel and hope nobody notices." They noticed Oren. 30 seconds of observation, and that man knew everything about us. Occupied, supplied, small. The only reason he didn't push harder is that we weren't worth the delay. What happens when someone decides we are? I watched the room absorb this. I watched Priya nod slowly. I watched Gil's face shift from loss to possibility. I watched Marcus sit straighter. I watched Elena look at her brother, and I saw something pass between them. A sibling communication that I couldn't decode, but that resolved in Marcus turning to Dana and saying, "Tell us what to do." Dana looked at me. She was asking for something she didn't need, my endorsement, because she understood that the transition she was proposing required the person who'd brought the key to this building to agree that the building's purpose had changed. I'd come here because the station was the last place I'd been worth something. I'd sealed it because sealing things was what I knew. Every modification, every protocol, every watched approach to every external threat had been governed by the conviction that the walls were the point, that inside was safety, and outside was loss. And now, a 28-year-old firefighter, with 4 years on the job, was telling me that the walls were the problem. I thought about Justin Kerrigan, about reading the smoke wrong, about the difference between a mistake and negligence, and whether it mattered, about the board and Haggerty, and the key they forgot to take back, about driving north when south was home, because home was a rental, and this was the only place where my decisions had consequences. "Run it," I said. The transformation of Station 2 from sealed fortress to open node took 11 days, and it required us to learn a new kind of fear. The old fear was penetration, something getting in, breaching the perimeter, violating the container. The new fear was exposure. Being visible, being known, being subject to the judgment and intention of everyone who encountered us. The old fear was architectural. The new fear was social. And the new fear was worse, because there was no weld that could fix it. Dana designed the interface, the personnel door, the only original entry point I hadn't modified beyond its factory spec, became the contact point. We built a covered porch over it from materials Oren scavenged, a roof to keep rain off, a bench for waiting, a board where we posted information, water conditions, infected density reports from Ruth's roof logs, route intelligence from the mesh, medical availability. The board faced outward. Anyone passing on Route 9 could read it from the road. Priya established a clinic protocol. She would treat anyone who came to the door, for any condition, using our supplies, asking nothing in return except information. Where had they come from? What had they seen? What did they know? The information flowed into the mesh through Carolyn's network and from the mesh back to us. And within 2 weeks, the Station 2 node had become one of the most active intelligence points in southern Vermont. People came not because we had the most supplies, we didn't, but because we had the most current picture of the region. And a current picture was worth more than a case of canned food in a world where the landscape changed daily. Oren adapted, not happily. He maintained his objections for the record and kept a running tally of resource expenditure that he updated on the whiteboard daily. A visual argument against generosity expressed in declining numbers. But he built the porch. He fabricated a lockable medical cabinet for the clinic area. He designed a pass-through window in the personnel door that allowed Priya to treat patients without fully opening the entry. His objections were philosophical. His hands were cooperative. I noticed and said nothing. Marcus and Elena became the station's external operators. Marcus ran supply routes and scouting missions with a competence that had grown beyond his age into something that simply was. He moved through the terrain of his collapsed hometown with a fluency that neither Dana nor I could match because we'd learned the landscape as adults and he was learning it as a native, the way you learn a language in childhood. Without grammar, without rules, with total absorption. Elena, who had been the quietest person in the building for 7 weeks, found her function in the mesh. She had an ear for radio, the ability to distinguish signal from noise, to isolate a voice in static, to track a conversation across frequency hops. And within a week, she was running our communication schedule solo, logging contacts, maintaining the network, building the picture. Their mother never came. No signal. No report from any mesh node. No body found by any scouting mission. She had entered the category of the unresolved. Not dead, not alive, suspended. And Marcus and Elena carried that suspension in different ways. Marcus carried it as fuel. Elena carried it as silence. Neither way was better. Both ways were human. On day 60, the column came back south. Smaller now, maybe 200. And slower. They'd hit something north of Montpelier that had reduced them, and the lead man who'd knocked on our door 6 weeks earlier walked into our porch area and read the board and sat on the bench and waited. Priya treated 2 of his people for infections. I gave him a mesh summary of conditions between Northfield and the Massachusetts border. He gave us 6 cases of MREs and a functioning car battery and the name of his group. The Valley Train, which was what they called themselves, and the name of a man named Ochoa, who was establishing a permanent settlement at a decommissioned school in White River Junction, 30 miles north, and who was asking for people with medical, engineering, and communications skills. When the Valley Train left the next morning, they left behind the information that there was a place 30 miles away that wanted exactly what we had. Not our building, not our walls. Us. The people we'd become inside these walls. The nurse, the engineer, the communicator, the scout, the watchwoman, the route finder, the officer, the man who'd read the smoke wrong and was trying to read it right. That night, I sat on the roof alone, not on watch. Ruth was on watch. Ruth was always on watch. I sat on the parapet with my legs hanging over the edge and looked at the town that had been my professional home for 16 years and my accidental refuge for 60 days. And I thought about what it meant that I'd come here because I'd lost the right to be a firefighter and was leaving because someone 30 miles away needed me to be one again. Not a firefighter. The job was gone. The institution was gone. The trucks, the shifts, the chain of command, the board that judged you, and the chief who wouldn't look at you. All gone. What wasn't gone was the thing underneath the job. The thing that had made me drive toward the Sirens when I was 8 years old and never stopped driving toward them. The willingness to enter the burning building. The willingness to read the smoke, knowing you might read it wrong. Knowing that reading it wrong had consequences you'd carry in your body for the rest of your life. And reading it anyway because someone was on the second floor and the fire was moving and you were the one at the door. I found Dana in the kitchen. She was packing. She already knew. White River Junction, she said. White River Junction. All of us? Everyone who wants to go. The building stays open. The mesh relay stays active. Anyone who wants to stay and run it stays. But the rest of us move. You're leaving the station. I'm leaving the station. She looked at me for a long time. Then she said, "It's a good read, Ward." I didn't know if she was right. I knew it was the read I had. I knew that smoke was rising somewhere to the north, and people were inside it, and I was the one at the door. We left on day 62, 9 of us. Dana, Priya, Oren, Marcus, Elena, Gil, Ruth, Sam Ouellette, and me. The others stayed. The door stayed open. The board stayed posted. The mesh stayed live. 30 miles of Vermont terrain between us and whatever was waiting. The station got smaller behind us. Then the road curved and it was gone. I looked back once. Not at the building. The road had already taken that. But at the idea of it. The sealed space, the welded doors, the container I'd made because making containers was the only thing I understood. For 62 days, I'd lived inside a building I had no right to occupy and turned it into something its architects never intended. And now I was walking away from it with 8 people who trusted me to read the road ahead and a track record that included one catastrophic misread that had put a man in a wheelchair for life. The smoke to the north was real. I could see it above the tree line, a gray-white column bending east in the wind. It could have been anything. A structure fire, a signal, an accident, a weapon. I didn't know. I read what I could see. Color, volume, movement, the way it bent, the speed of its rise. I took in the information. I made my assessment. I kept walking. The road was open and the fire was ahead, and I was no longer behind a door.